Hi, this is your little catch up explainer video for the third lesson we did this week on socialism. So, this was the one we did on Tuesday. It's about another idea, core idea, therefore, a thing which socialists tend to agree on, um, which is going to go into our first paragraph of our 24-mark question. And so far, we've looked at society and class being really important, about human nature. This is the big one, I suppose. This is about the economy, and I'll explain why that is shortly. Okay, let's get rid of this little button. So, what's going on in this one? We're going to try and think about the way in which the economy is so central and it's related to what socialists think the government should do. We're not really going to spend a lot of time looking at differences between lots of socialists, but we will begin to. I'll set you a little bit of homework on finding out some more about the key thinkers we'll look at next week, which is Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. So in the session that we did in the live session, which took obviously a bit longer, about an hour, we're going to try and squeeze that down a little bit. So there'll be some things that I just kind of whiz through and you can look at in your own time. Like this one, for example. Normally in the classroom, I get people to, there's a play here, which you can see, it says, let's read the play together. I give somebody a part, I take a part. It's a funny play, really. It's just to get you thinking about the fact that there's a coal owner, for example, who is on trial. And one of the reasons he's on trial is because he is stealing the wealth of the workers, the miners who work in his colliery. And that's the whole point, really, is just to get us into the idea that when we think about the economy and who are the real wealth creators, it's the people who are actually doing the work and the people who own and control what we'll call the means of production, the factories and everything else. They're not doing the work, but they are taking the value, the extra value that's created by people when they're at work, surplus after they've been paid their wages. And that's how they get rich. And of course, that's how the gap between rich and poor grows as well. And these are things which socialists don't like about the current system and would want to change. So what are we saying then? Well, this is not a new thing. And it's not necessarily something which is unique to capitalism. About, what are we talking, 600 odd years now, during the Peasants' Revolt, there was a famous radical priest called John Bull. And he had a great phrase which he used in sermons when he went around the country preaching to peasants about why they were being unfairly treated. He said that when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? And what he really meant was, look, if God created the world, God started with two people and there was no class difference between them. There was no exploitation between them. They were both workers and they both shared what they produced in common. And so what John Bull was doing, in a kind of slightly biblical and lyrical sort of way, was highlighting that unequal distribution of property is not natural, and it's something which is guaranteed by having class inequality, which kind of creates groups who have property and keep hold of it and get other people to work at their expense. So, okay, what does this mean when we come to look at the socialists? The socialists we'll think about of our 19th and 20th and 21st century socialists. How is their view different from that of capitalists and, let's say, for sake of argument, liberals? Well, when we've looked at liberals before, one of the things we often talk about is that whilst everybody has the same political and social rights, when it comes to the economy, it's a free-for-all. And free-for-all is a good way of describing it, of course, because they're interested in free competition, the exercise of free will, the freedom to use your property as you will. And their argument is that some people are more able, work harder, or we in a meritocracy are going to rise to the top. So that inequality comes from the fact that it's the individual citizens are able to make the most of their own abilities. And they do so because they're egotistical and self-centered, and that it's a natural feature of human nature for them to acquire, to strive and to seek. I think that's a Tennyson poem. Socialists, on the other hand, don't think that. They think if there's an inequality, the reason why there's inequality is because it's an unnatural outcome of a developing economy in which some people have managed to secure the resources, the property, the means of producing that property as well, and that they make themselves richer at other people's expense by exploiting them, and then use political oppression to maintain that situation as well. So by contrast, therefore, for socialists, human nature and the way which relates to the economy isn't self-seeking, but actually should be egalitarian, fraternal, and we can only really have that kind of relationship about fraternity, brotherhood, that means, and egalitarianism, if we share economic resources in common and not just guarantee political and equal rights. Because it's only by sharing economic resources that what we're going to do is eradicate the power of one group over another. Because the lack of freedom that working class people have is born of the fact that they don't control or own the resources in society. They have to sell their time to people who do own and control those resources. And they have to sell it for whatever they can get for it, which means they have to work longer than they would normally want to and work for less than they would normally want to. Therefore, if it's the economy which is producing class inequality, if you want to get a classless society, you've got to change the economy. So this is a really important thing for us, for socialists, because it talks about how the economy is the root of how society is organized and how humans behave and what the government should do, how the government behaves, and the root of how we could change society as well. And therefore, we would need to see what's wrong with capitalism and then see how we can change capitalism. Okay, so what is it that's wrong with capitalism? And here I pause for a minute because when we're thinking about socialism and feminism, actually, we're going to think about them in quite special ways. With liberalism and conservatism, we were simply describing the world as it is and how it's become. But because socialists and feminists are interested in change, they're interested in transforming society, then we're always going to look at the economy, the state, and whatever else in two different ways. How is it now and what's wrong with it? And what would it be like if socialists and feminists were successful in achieving their goals? So we'll start with this one. What's wrong with capitalism as socialists see it? And we're going to say four things here. Okay. The first one is that not only do we have inequality, as John Ball described, but capitalism has created much greater inequality because it's created much more capacity for the people who own and control production, factories, etc., to be able to get more out of the workers who are producing things and to exploit them more, partly because of technology. And what that means is that the greater that inequality, then the more likely it is that it becomes much less solidaristic. There's less solidarity, less kind of fraternity as well. So the greater inequality, the greater the amount of competition and self-interest and antisocial alienation, I suppose, one person from each other. So capitalism is socially a worse system than the others, even if it's economically more productive. That alienation maximizes, or rather that specialization, I suppose we can call it in the capitalist system, maximizes the ability to make profit and makes us more likely to become more and more specialized and more like cogs in a machine who have no control over the thing we produce and no way of identifying what contribution we're making to society. In the lesson, session, and I normally talk about this, make a comparison between a peasant in the 14th and 15th century and somebody working in, the dark satanic mills of Manchester or Burnley or Blackburn in the 19th century. And in the 14th and 15th century, you would have probably spent about 60 or 70 days working for the Lord, doing a harvest when it was required and doing whatever else they required you to do. But the rest of the time would have been your own. And the day's work wouldn't have taken all day. And at different times of the year, in fact, it would have taken very little time as well, because it wasn't much to do with agriculture. So in which case, you'd have lots more free time, lots more time to spend with your family, lots more time to relax, lots more time to produce crafts or to engage in things that peasants like to do, like feast days or sing, or, develop songs or storytelling and all sorts of things. There was a real human connection. I'm not saying for a minute that it was great fun to be a peasant in the 14th or 15th century, but it was probably less dehumanizing than to be an industrial factory worker working 15 hours a day, living in a terrible terraced accommodation with no toilets, with 10 people in a household in the 19th century, the beginning of capitalism. Okay. One of the things about capitalism is not that it's all bad, but that in fact, what capitalism has done for the first time has produced a superabundance of stuff. Technology has allowed us for the first time ever to be able to eradicate poverty if we wanted to. So one of the reasons why socialists want to abolish it is because it produces these amazing things, but then concentrates them in the hands of a tiny, tiny few people, 0.01% of billionaires, for example, having more wealth than more than half the world's population. In that case, the problems that we have can all be solved by redistributing those things which capitalism has been able to give us the possibility of producing. And finally, capitalism needs to be abolished because capitalism is inherently unstable as a system. And far from it being something which can be just left to itself as a kind of laissez-faire free market economy reaching its own equilibrium, what capitalism does is produce overproduction, and because it pays workers so little, underconsumption, and that leads to periodic crises. We saw a little bit about this when we're looking at modern liberalism and Keynes. But these periodic crises are incredibly destructive in terms of throwing people out of work. That's waste. All that time that anybody who could work is not working as much as they want to is not only making them more likely to be poor, but it's wasting a potential resource that human society could be using. And one of the things that socialists want to argue is that not only will capitalism effectively destroy itself by these increasing crises, but that a socialist society would be much less wasteful. Come back to that one in a moment. Okay, so what's the headline for this one then is, why do they want to get rid of it? Because the market doesn't do what liberals say it does and simply work for the benefit of everybody in society. Now, I've covered lots of ground in here, and one of the things we're going to say is almost all socialists agree with most of this to some extent or another. We're going to look at all the differences later on. So how would they change it then? And again, I'm going to try and cover this and say, look, this is what most of them would agree on, even if there are differences about how they would apply it or the extent to which they would apply it as well. So the point, therefore, first of a socialist economy is not to let it run riot as a kind of free-for-all so that some people can accumulate as much profit as they can. Profit seeking itself is not the objective of the economy. The point of the economy, since it's made by human beings, is to meet the needs of human beings. And therefore, developing a way in which you can plan rationally and think about what is it that people need and then produce according to those needs is the objective for socialism. Let's start with redistribution. So all socialists think that if capitalism does not produce things and then distribute them according to people's needs, which is why we have people who go without, therefore one of the things we need to do is correct it. And this can either be an intermediate step for people who are like full socialists, I suppose we'll call them fundamental socialists who want to abolish capitalism, or it can be something which social democrats and new Labour type people who don't want to abolish capitalism but want to take its sharp edges off, they'll all agree that some element of redistribution is an objective for a socialist economy or an economy with some socialism in it. And that can be through progressive taxation. The more wealth that people earn, the more tax they pay, so that can then be distributed either through guaranteeing decent wages for people or through welfareism or through provision of public services. That public spending also is a means not just of redistribution, but of using the state to guarantee that the economy is meeting some public needs and guaranteeing some public goods. So health, education. And again, this is one of those ones in which it depends on what kind of socialist you are as to how far you think this goes. Because once you get over the idea that all things should be provided by a private economy, like, we think about America, for example, where the health service is, in private medical insurance companies' hands. If we say instead, okay, well, definitely health, that's important because that meets the needs. And so we're not going to try and make a profit. We're going to plan to guarantee that we take some money from the economy and put that into it. Education is something which is free at the point of use to everybody who wants to use it. We could go further. What about a society that might need transport? Free transport. Everybody's got to go to work. So why not make it easier for them by just guaranteeing that everybody gets free transport? Public transport as well, which would be more environmentally friendly, and the more investment goes into it, then the better it is and more people will use it as well. What about leisure, free leisure? Since we know that leisure is good for people, and we know that it's good for people to go to the gym, and it's good for people to get exercise, it's good for people to relax, recharge their batteries, why not guarantee ways of people having free leisure activities, free cinema tickets, free all sorts of things? So this idea about public spending is a means by which you can deliver those public goods. Okay, One other feature of the economy is that currently in capitalism, we have the economy controlled by capitalists who are competing with each other, but also who are trying to make sure that they acquire the profits at the expense of the workers who are working for them. How much better then to have workers in control of society, to have workers in control of the factories, so that the workers decide how much they think they need to produce. And the workers decide what hours they are working. And the workers decide what kind of recompense or reward, if they're going to have it, or indeed whether they need one of those as well. And how great wouldn't it be for workers in one industry to coordinate with workers in another industry instead of competing with them, to collaborate with them so that they're not overproducing things, so we don't have a needless waste and needless surplus. But in fact, we can produce things where there is a need for them. So we stop producing tanks, start producing landmine removal in the short term, for example. Finally, then, all socialists agree on common ownership, and all socialists want to secure all of the kind of, if you want to think of them as profits, all of the things that are produced by society in general, instead of them being isolated and kept in the hands of a few people as big piles of private property, to be shared in common. And the only way for that to happen is for the state in the short term to take it over. We can call this what you like: nationalization, public ownership, common ownership, or whatever. But if we think about what happens with the health service, then we think about other types of industries. So after 1945, for example, coal, steel, the British Airways used to be called BOAC, British Rail, telecoms, all these things were owned and controlled by the state, with the notion that they would be run on behalf of the people and to meet the needs of the people, to keep the costs down and to guarantee that everybody shared in what they produced. Okay, so we know what's wrong with capitalism. We know what socialists would do differently. How might it be different then? I gave us a kind of Kahoot type thing as a poll in the session that we did on here, but I'll just say briefly what we talked about. So we had a dispute about whether socialism could get rid of unemployment. And one of the ways in which I tried to encourage people in the lesson to think about this was to not see unemployment as a problem, because if everybody's economic needs were met automatically because you just got food when you wanted to, or you've got, which is the purple one we're going to look at in a minute, or you had housing, you needed it, then actually the business of work wouldn't become something which was like an enforced idleness which people wanted to avoid. But actually we'd be thinking about, look, if some people are working too hard and other people have got no work at all, let's spread it around and let's make sure everybody therefore can plan, and we can all have 3-day weeks or 4-day weeks or 2-day weeks or whatever it was that we decided was necessary at the time. And of course, one way of doing this is rationalizing where people need to work and where people don't need to work as well. So socialists often think about the way in which we could maximize leisure time, and then people could do all sorts of other creative things with their leisure time too. The second one is also about, could we redistribute everything for free? So we already do this with the NHS to some extent, mostly, and we do it with education. What about things like free cars? What about giving every street a number of electric cars which they could then share between each other? If you walk down any street, you're going to see loads of parked cars outside the houses. Those are cars which are going to waste, not doing anything. And one of the things I argued was that, in a capitalist society, a car is a status symbol. Therefore, human nature is making us buy a new car, try and have a posher car than our neighbours, manufacturing a want by advertising that we should change our car every year, and so on and so forth. But instead, in a socialist society, if we thought that wasn't such an important thing to have as a status symbol, but in fact, our status, or at least our kind of the way in which we thought of each other positively, was that we all shared in things, then we all might take part in sharing some cars, some e-cars on our street, just for when we wanted to go to the beach on a weekend or something like that. And we wouldn't need a car for every household, or 2 cars for every household, or 3 cars for every household. Okay. The third one, will people bother to work under socialism? Most people's big problem with this is that if you're going to give everybody something for free, then what's the incentive for people to work? What's the incentive for people to do anything? And one of the things we talked about was that we can't really think about the economy without thinking about the socialist economy, without thinking about the changes that would take place in human nature, or that is to say, how people think and behave. So currently people think about they only go to work because there'll be some wages at the end of it, and they'll force themselves to go to some terrible drudge type job because there'll at least be some sort of pay at the end of it. But if instead we thought that all of our needs were going to be met, then the work that we do would be socially useful and we're making a contribution. Then the way in which people valued each other and valued their time would be, can I make as much of a social contribution, a useful contribution to society as I can? And in that sense, we might expect people to do more of things like volunteering. So currently in society, we have lots of people who are very well-meaning and altruistic and want to do something good for society, and they give away their time for free. And they might be a model for the sort of people that we're going to have in a socialist society. Okay. I'm going to leave the green one for a minute because I think we've been talking about these things. But one of the things I want you to understand when you're writing about this is that if you get an essay that says you've got to write about the socialist economy, then you can also make links from the socialist economy to how the state should behave, how that would change human nature or be changed by human nature, and how it would therefore change the way in which society is organized in terms of class. Right, as usual, I think I've spent much more time on this one than I meant to. If you wanted to know a bit more about this particular core idea, then you could do worse than look at this article. What would a socialist economy look like? And then if you've got any questions about it, you can come back and ask me about them in future. Okay, that was your recap on socialism and the economy.